Yeah. What's up,
Good afternoon.
What's up, Dave Nash? Can you do that? No.
So Pastor Ben Morris has served as our campus pastor at Western Viterbo and UW La Crosse for 8 years, I believe. Mm-hmm. And here he is to join us to help us toward a part of what is reconciling in Christ that we've talked maybe a little bit about, but would like to consider a lot more. And that is a land recognition statement as we consider, I'll let Ben say more specifics about it, but we're really glad you're here. Thank you for taking a part of your day. He's been busy all morning doing all kinds of other things, and so to make time for us, thank you.
Well, good morning. I've done this talk a few times, and I never know quite how to begin, because I'm going to invite us into let's just say it, to a pretty heavy space. Jesus said the truth will set you free. But I think when we talk about certain issues, before we're set free, the truth is going to break your heart, and it's going to challenge you. And what we have to talk about today will involve taking a swing directly at the national myth of our nation. Because we were raised to believe that our nation is a city on a hill, a beacon of light, and of freedom, and of justice. But if we're going to talk about the 500-year experience of colonization that indigenous North Americans have undergone, we will look at our country through a completely different lens. And so, and I want to acknowledge that for a lot of us, this could potentially be deeply uncomfortable. And it has happened where people have become quite angry. So I want to begin with this. Everything that I'm going to say is going to be a fact. And I'm just going to put the facts on the screen. And the facts are going to be hard. We good from there? How are we feeling? Okay. I'm going to begin with Lumen, our campus ministry's land recognition statement. It's on our website. We say it before we do things. We recognize that Lumen occupies the land of the Ho-Chunk people and is in the sacred watershed of the La Crosse, Black, and Mississippi rivers. Please take a moment to honor and celebrate this sacred watershed and the sacred land of all indigenous people. Actually, we've since updated that to add a clause that say, we recognize the church's role in the genocide of indigenous North Americans and the attempted destruction of their culture, religion, and peoples. So we're going to begin with a little bit about myself. I cannot tell you why my life has gone this way, other than telling you that it has, and I feel like there's an obligation in my life for that. So on the upper left, you'll see Reverend Harold Eaglebull. He's my Hunka father. So I spent a year of my life on the Leech Lake Reservation doing a Horizon internship, and he was my supervisor. He's an Episcopal priest and a Lakota medicine man from Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And about 6 years ago, we went through the Hunka ceremony, and I became his son, and he became my father. On the other side of the Wichitari statue is Tuesday, my Hunka sister, and her daughter, Dea. Dea is now 21. When she was 17, she came and lived with my family for a year. She came after her father hanged himself in the basement, because where she's from, the suicide rate is 7 times the national average. While she was living with us, 3 of her friends killed themselves. They were high schoolers. She's from the Pine Ridge Reservation, where the net family income is $14,000 a year. The middle photo, my little daughter Winifred and me, with Faye and Kay McGowan Givens. Faye and Kay are Choctaw twins. Kay is the mom of my best friend, Danny, who I grew up with. Kay died this last year. It was the type of funeral where I dropped everything in my life and paid an exorbitant fee on airfare so I could get home, because Kay's the second mom to me. That's her twin sister, Faye. Grew up in poverty in Mississippi. They were part of the Choctaws who snuck back after the Trail of Tears. They moved up during Indian relocation in the 1950s and 60s, where the federal government tried to entice natives to leave their reservations and get jobs in the upper northern cities with the goal that they would just eventually just stop being Indians. Faye and Kay have been fearless advocates for indigenous causes. They are the joint authors of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People. So they've stood at the United Nations General Assembly, and they got some rules passed that Native people have rights to their language, to their faith traditions, to their culture. Down in the lower right is Ben Ramirez Shikwanabe, beloved professor of mine in college, my Native American Studies professor. It's in his class that I learned Ojibwe, and some of his research is what I'll be talking about today. So, like I said, I don't know why I was kind of raised around Native Americans, and wherever I've gone, I've found myself working with indigenous people. That ministry continues today. But I always feel like it's a sacred obligation to have been part of these beloved people's lives and what they've taught me, and with that comes an obligation, I think, to talk about what I've learned and all of its hardship and all of its beauty and joy. So next up, we got a quiz. How many tribes are there in the U.S. today? You can talk amongst yourselves for a second. How many do you think? What are the answers? That's a big question. Yeah, so I believe the numbers I'm working with are federally recognized tribes. Throw out some numbers. What do we think? 100, 500? The latter one's closest. Still a little low, but pretty close. 574. So when we talk about Native Americans, we're not talking about one block of people. We live on the land of the Ho-Chunk. They speak a Siouan language. To the north of us are the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe people. They speak an Algonquin language. Those languages are linguistically as separate as Italian is from Japanese. That is to say, they have nothing to do with each other. That's how diverse, and we're only talking about what is now the United States. We're not even factoring in Canada and all of Latin America from, well, let's be honest, like traditionally, Colorado all the way to the tip of Patagonia, right? Next question. How many treaties were signed with tribes? Many but few kept. Thousands, all right, yeah. 368. And I'll answer your next question. It wasn't a few kept. We've never honored a single treaty. Not one. Does anybody know what treaties are on a legal standing for the United States? It's in our Constitution. Article 4, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. The clause in Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution declaring that the Constitution, quote, all laws made in furtherance of the Constitution and all treaties made under the authority of the United States are the supreme law of the land. Nothing can override treaties. We've kept none of them. This is also why when how many of you were around in the 70s when our indigenous neighbors were fighting for their hunting and fishing rights? This is why the state had nothing to do with that. Treaty law supersedes the states. States have no control over what happens because treaties are only signed between nations. The state of Wisconsin cannot sign a treaty with Canada, right? Only the U.S. can sign a treaty with Canada. And so what happened is during the treaty period, the United States signed legal documents ratified in our Congress with 300 plus Native American nations. We treated with them no differently than we treated with Germany at the end of the two wars, European Union on a trade agreement, right? These are legally binding United States law. And we've broke every single one of them. Here's another chunk of our legal document history. In our redress of grievances to King George III, we name Native Americans in our Declaration of Independence when we call them merciless Indian savages. So in our two founding documents, we name Native nations. In one, we call them merciless Indian savages. In the other one, we recognize them as nations, not dependents, but nations with whom we treat no differently than European, Asian, or Latin American powers. Does that make sense? We've always been on a nation-to-nation relationship. Here's our current situation. This loop around where we live is not even the historical extent of Ho-Chunk land, but it's where they're currently saying, like, we know we have a lot of historical ties with these places. So how did this all start? How many of you know, have you heard about the doctrine of discovery? Okay. It comes from a papal bull. I'm trying to think of the name off my head. So there was a papal bull after Columbus stumbled across what is now called the West Indies. This whole new land to Europeans was discovered from a European perspective. But the Portuguese also had some inklings about, there's some belief that the Portuguese might have found Brazil before Columbus did, but just were keeping it very, very secret. You can tell that by the line drawn down. So what happens in the doctrine of discovery is the Pope gives permission to Spain and Portugal that no matter where they go in the world, if they land on shores that don't have Christians on them, they can take those lands and do what they want with them and their people. Does anybody know where Columbus first landed? In the Bahamas. Yeah. So we call the sea, what's the sea there called? The Caribbean, named after who? Yeah, what's the state of the Caribs today? There's no Caribs. That's a complete genocide. Along with the Arawak. In fact, what you'll find is most of the places of first contact, those people are completely wiped off the face of the earth. That's a language system that we'll never know how. I mean, we look at all these problems in the world today and how many cultures might have some answers for these moments that we find ourselves in, these existential moments, but we'll never know because their language is gone, their spirituality is gone, the people themselves are gone. But this happened in the United States too. So I'll bring us with an uncomfortable thought experiment. How many of you know the history of the Third Reich? So there's a lot of atrocities committed by the Third Reich. But the invasion of the Slavic lands is one I want us to think about. Because what Hitler saw was that the German people were quite numerous, and they were in a very small chunk of land. So they adopted an idea called Lebensraum, which means room to live. And in the Nazis' view, that was to the east of them, the vast Slavic frontier. Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Untermensch, people who weren't quite as good as the Germans were. And the view was, we're going to take over this land, and we can enslave them or we can kill them off. It doesn't matter, because what matters is we need room to live. And they were stopped from doing that. But from the 1500s on, in North America, the Lebensraum program happened. But we don't frame it up like that, do we? All of us are sitting right now in a church on land that was occupied by other people who had a spiritual and cultural connection to the land, and they were simply removed and murdered and impoverished and forced to assimilate, to the point where we don't even think about that as us inheriting atrocity. And we know part of that because before Hitler started his programs, he sent high-level Nazi researchers to America to study how we are so successful at subjugating our indigenous and black populations. And they created reams of research documentation. So before Auschwitz was ever planned, before the gas chambers were built, they sat down in a nice, orderly Western European fashion and discussed their research projects of, look at the American. Hitler spoke so highly of America because he said they did it, and they've convinced themselves they didn't even do it, and that's our goal, that future generations of Germans won't even have to think about the genocide we do. Because none of us think about the genocide that happened to create the world we live in. In fact, some of you are probably like, I can't believe he keeps saying the word genocide to describe what's happened, because it couldn't possibly be that. Well, look at the lands left for tribal peoples. But northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, the UP, Minnesota, over Lake Superior, that was Anishinaabe territory. Down to little squares. The Ho-Chunk lived from here out to Lake Winnebago, down to by Chicago. The up close to the UP, the big square there, those are New York tribes. The Menominee, Stockbridge, Muncie. Those are tribes that aren't even native here. They were removed from the Adirondacks and sent here. The Kickapoo aren't even on the map. The Kickapoo are in Mexico and Kansas. The only reason the Ho-Chunks are here is because they were removed 5 times and they just kept coming back and they kept beating the army back here. When you drive down the Great River Road and it says the Battle of the Bad Axe, the Battle of the Bad Axe was when our cavalry chased families from their homes. And we chased them to the Mississippi River where a gunboat was waiting with our brand new weapons, and we just mowed them all down. And then we put a memorial up and said it was a battle. When it happened at Wounded Knee, when we mowed down families of Lakota men, women, and children, we gave every perpetrator of it the Congressional Medal of Honor because they used the brand new Hotchkiss machine gun to kill babies. They got the Medal of Honor for it, right? This is hard stuff, but it doesn't end. There's multiple periods. There's initial contact. We estimate that the population of native North America before Columbus was about 90 million people. Most of them will be destroyed within a century by disease, smallpox, things which there was no natural immunity to. Then, after the French and Indian Wars, the border of this country was supposed to be the Appalachian Mountains, upon which the United States promised we would not expand. Till Andrew Jackson. An Indian removal, an official policy to send Indians west of the Mississippi to Indian Territory, Oklahoma, which would be forever Indian territory west of the Mississippi. So the border keeps moving, and the story keeps moving, and the treaties keep getting made, and they keep getting broken. To what we have left is a remnant. And I was sitting in that pew here just 2 weeks ago. As pastors, we sat in horror looking at what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians and saying, I can't believe they would do that. Well, I think we all can believe that they would do that because we did it. We are doing it today. So after we move through the treaty period, and when the Plains Wars come to an end in around 1898, we use the Wounded Knee as the official end of the Plains Wars. Plains Wars were during Western expansion, where the Western tribes who put up some of the strongest struggles were slowly whittled away. Because it didn't matter what battles you won, because on the eastern seaboard of the United States, there were just millions more people, more soldiers you could keep tossing in. I think about my family coming off the boat from Ireland in a potato famine, starved out under the thumb of the brutal imperial English just to show up here and become the brutal imperialist Irish-American troops out west, right? After the wars, we entered what was called the reservation period. And that was with these little chunks of land that Native Americans would go onto them. And the treaties all stated that we would supply them, if they gave up their ancestral lands and their ancestral way of life, we would take care of them with food and health care and housing. This is in the treaty. So I want you to just tuck that away in your mind. In the legal treaty we signed, we said we would give them food, housing, and health care. So if anybody ever says Indians just sit there and they just live off the government, no, they don't. They exchanged the entire damn country, and the promise was they would get food, housing, and health care. My niece grew up in a house that is absolutely falling apart and covered in black mold, and there's no remediation for her. We realized that she had anxiety when she moved in with us because our pantries were full all the time. Because the poorest place in the Western Hemisphere is the nation of Haiti. And the second poorest place in the Western Hemisphere isn't some other third world country that we'd say, oh, how'd that happen? It's the Pine Ridge Reservation. It goes Haiti, then the Lakota. And it's all happening in the richest country that's ever existed. And all the wealth is coming from the mineral and land resources that we've exploited from what we stole, right? I'm sorry if this is like I told you it was going to be heavy, right? There's no way around this history. So the next stage was after the Indian Wars, we forced them onto reservations. How many of you have ever heard the phrase or used the phrase like, oh, he's gone off the reservation? Do you know what that means? It was illegal for Indians to leave the reservation. They weren't allowed to. Next pop quiz. When did Native Americans get U.S. citizenship? Not until the 1930s were they considered citizens of this country. When did Native Americans get religious freedom? Where's religious freedom guaranteed for us? Yeah, First Amendment, 1789 ratification. When did Native Americans get religious freedom? 1976. Only fully given during the Clinton administration when the act was passed to allow Native Americans access to their own sacred medicines like peyote. So during the reservation period, the goal was to put them onto reservations, but then the next problem came. Well, in an expanding country, we needed new land. The Treaty of Fort Laramie for the Lakota ceded like southern Minnesota and parts of North Dakota and South Dakota east of the Missouri River, but they maintained North and South Dakota west of the Missouri River, Wyoming, eastern Montana, most of Nebraska. That's the Fort Laramie Treaty. That's the legally binding law of the land. But they now live on a scattered small 7 reservations, which is why when Standing Rock happened, everybody's like, why are these natives getting so mad at what's happening over here? That's not their land. Well, according to the Fort Laramie Treaty, which is, again, Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, it's absolutely their land. Bismarck sits on stolen land. It's not treaty land, right? During the early reservation period, the promises of food showed up very late. The meat oftentimes was tainted. It was rotted food from Chicago's meatpacking. The goal was to make life so miserable that they'd either die or give up. They didn't. Life became so difficult that progressives out east in the late 1800s came up with an idea. We need to civilize these savages. So we'll provide schooling for them. The motto of these schools was, save the man, kill the Indian. So we'll talk about the boarding school experience, which has been the single most traumatic experience in the whole terrible process. Oh. Thought I had a slide for that. The boarding schools operated up into the 1960s, some of them into the 70s. They're not in the far past. Children were taken from their home. These were laws passed. Children were taken from their home by Bureau of Indian Affairs agents, police officers, oftentimes at the threat of violence and gunpoint. Children were taken out of the arms of their mothers, and they were shipped off to boarding schools all across the country. Oftentimes, these boarding schools were run by churches. At the boarding schools, children were routinely malnourished. Children were routinely sexually assaulted. At the excavation of the boarding school by Muskegon, Michigan, they just found baby skeleton upon baby skeleton because the children were murdered right after birth. By boarding schools run by the church. Canada has begun excavating their boarding schools. We're in the process of beginning. They have found at their boarding schools hundreds and sometimes thousands of skeletons of children. We will find the same at ours, including the one that the Norwegian Lutheran Church ran in Toma. That's right, we operated boarding schools. In the boarding schools, and I've worked with many boarding school survivors in my time working on reservations with indigenous people. They were beaten for speaking their indigenous language. I know a woman who told me one day, she said, do you know why I don't like your Christianity? This is when I was on the res, and I was like, oh, in my mind, like, oh God, why? She said, because every time I spoke Ojibwe, the priest would make me kneel on marbles and hold a Bible out in each hand and say the Lord's Prayer in English. When the boarding school generation graduated and went home and started their own families, who would then be kidnapped and taken to schools, an entire generation, based on so much abuse and trauma, decided that the best thing they could do for their kids is not teach them their language, not teach them their culture. That the best way to keep their children safe was just to hand them over without fight and hope for the best for when they came back home in 10 years. Most Native American languages are critically endangered at this point, and when they're gone forever. A lot of the answers we need in the middle of an ecological crisis are going to come from the indigenous inhabitants of the earth, because 90%, the most pristine places on the earth, if you look at the places that are the most undestroyed, and there's not many left, 90% of those around the earth are in the hands of indigenous people. Because indigenous people know how to keep the lands they've lived on for tens of thousands of years in balance. But those understandings are bound up in culture, language, and spiritualities, which in the next 20 years will probably, the majority of them will die off. Because the elders who grew up, Harold, my Hunka father, he grew up, he didn't learn English until he was 11. He knows his people's stories. His kids don't, because they didn't teach them to protect them from us. They would rather their kids not know their sacred way of life than to have white Christians beat and assault them into submission. When I say again that the crimes that we've perpetrated are on par with the Third Reich, I'm not exaggerating. And I still don't know how we reconcile everything we think about ourselves as a nation with what we have done and with what we continue to do. On the Pine Ridge Reservation, where I've spent so much time, I've told you about the poverty rate and the suicide rate. It's the highest rate of spousal abuse in the country. It's the highest rate of substance abuse in the country. The amount of substance abuse is rampant on reservations. Well, of course it is. The biggest factor for determining if somebody's going to develop substance abuse problems is childhood trauma. It's an entire ethnic groups of people that the one thing that natives know when they go anywhere that they'll share with each other is trauma. You can go from one tribe to the next, and many of their stories are very similar. And so this is what brings us kind of to today. We see indigenous people fighting. The resilient spirit has never gone away. From Standing Rock to the Stand Against Line 3 up in Minnesota, to the Bayou Bridge pipeline going through Louisiana, Native people are still fighting for their land, their water, and their air, which guess what? Is what we rely on to be alive. And while our heavy industries are pushing the ecosystem to an extinction level event, which is what our best ecologists are telling us, we are in the middle of the 7th great extinction. We call this the Anthropocene, the time period of the world where the entire globe is determined by what industrial consumer capitalism is doing to it. Our indigenous people are calling on us to join them in fights that our grandchildren need us to be fighting, and our great-grandchildren will need us to be fighting. Line 3 goes through their reservations. Line 3 is an oil pipeline to bring in tar sands oil from Enbridge Energy, which has the worst environmental track record of any fossil fuel company in North America. Enbridge has a line that goes under Lake Superior that has been given an F rating on how corroded it is. We're only at one disaster away from the Deepwater Horizon happening in Lake Superior, the largest body of fresh water on the planet. And our Ojibwe neighbors are asking us to join them in this fight. Every year, Ojibwe women, in Ojibwe culture, the women do the water ceremonies. The women are the sacred protectors of water. Every year, Ojibwe women at Ice Out will go gather water from Lake Itasca, the source of the Mississippi, clear, beautiful, and spring-fed, and they will walk down the entire length of the Mississippi. They'll be coming through here until they get to the Gulf of Mexico, where the Mississippi is one of the most polluted waterways in the world. And they pour the clean water from its source back into the river to remind the river of how she began, and that's not how she has to be. And they do this on all of our behalf. It's a lot, right? I mean, I'm kind of getting the looks that I typically get when I give this presentation. So what do we do? I don't have an answer for us, but I can tell you a really good place to start. What happens when you gather here? Well, we're Lutherans. Confession and forgiveness. We don't gather here to do forgiveness. We confess first. And confessing is no different than just telling the truth. And so a land recognition statement is the beginning process of telling the truth. We are on occupied land. Unless you are on a reservation in this country, you are on land that was by treaty not ceded most of the time. And remember that every treaty was also signed at gunpoint. So if I put a gun to Jason's head and said, sign me the deed to your house, and he did, could Jason take me to court and say, like, I did that under duress? That doesn't count, right? I'm not going to do it to Jason. I mean, it's a great house, but I'm not going to do it. Right? Jason could take, well, one, I should probably go to jail because I put a gun to his head to take his house, right? That's clear. But you can't sign legal documents under duress. There's not a single native nation that's signed a document in a happy moment. So no matter what, we're all on stolen land. And if you say, well, that's how things were, well, what happens if tomorrow China invaded the United States? We'd say that's not right. How many of you look at what's happening in Ukraine and say, Russia shouldn't be able to do that? Yeah. Did you know that Putin was brought up on war crimes last week? What was he brought up on? The specific charge was that Russians were taking Ukrainian children away from their families. We've been doing that. During the 1960s and 70s, at Bureau of Indian Affairs hospitals all across the country, when women were in childbirth, they were given a form to sign while they were in the pains of childbirth. When they signed that form, it gave the doctor permission to sterilize them. That's what the Nazis did. They forcibly sterilized people they didn't want breeding because vermin breed too much. That's what we did to Native women. We treated them like that. There's a crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women. Out in North Dakota, where they back in oil fields have gone up, criminal enterprises have stolen young Native women and they sell them to the oil workers as sex slaves. Our FBI doesn't do too much about it. That oil has to keep pumping, right? The oil's more important than the people. Again, everything that I'm saying is just, I can back that, this isn't like conspiracy theory stuff. This is just the documented history. I know our buddy Dr. Nash has worked with Gunderson, who does a lot of work on the Pine Ridge Reservation. So there's a lot of folks in this community who could also corroborate what they see and what they experience and the stories they hear out there. And so we begin with the recognition statement. This is what happened. Now, I know that I'm looking around the room, none of you personally went out and did this. But we've all benefited from it. So we begin by confessing the sins of our nation and the sins of our church, because our church has been a willing participant in this whole process. We begin by saying we are on Ho-Chunk land. The Ho-Chunk never ceded this land to us. And our government, at gunpoint, drove them to Oklahoma 5 times. And they came back every time. Which is why you don't see a Ho-Chunk reservation around here. They don't have a reservation. They were just cleared out. They've been slowly trying to build a land base back. So we say, this is what happened. We occupy this land. And the amazing thing is, we can also learn a lot about grace and forgiveness, because I have yet to meet a Native person who says, get on that boat, son, and go back to Ireland. There's a sense of, well, we're all here now. What are we going to do? Or as my Hunka father would say, your attempt to destroy us as a people also destroyed you as a people. Harold's understanding of the violent outbursts we see in this country, school shootings, mass shootings, his understanding is you came as violent marauders. And when you ran out of brown and black people to be violent towards, you never got the violence out of you, so now you're turning it on yourselves. And the only way to stop this gun violence that we have in white America is if we repent of the violence that we've brought with us for 500 years. And our Native American siblings, in so many ways, are waiting with open arms to take us through reconciliation ceremonies. Lutheran Campus Ministry on April 15th will be going through the blanket exercise with members of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And the Synod's going to do it with the pastors next, and we're trying to figure out how we can do reconciliation ceremonies with all of us. So I'm hoping that one day your pastors will stand in front of you and say, Our Ho-Chunk neighbors want to help us heal, all of us together. Do you want to be there? And I'm hoping your answer is, yeah, I want to be there. I want to be part of the next stage of this long journey we've been on with each other. And when your leadership team says, maybe it's time for first to work on a land recognition statement, that everybody who's here and has listened to this says, I think that's worth looking into. And how do we do it? And then we'll be working with our Ho-Chunk neighbors, Larry Littlegeorge and the Alliance for Justice out in Black River Falls, and the Littlejohn family here in La Crosse, or over there in La Crosse, we're not Alaska, I forget. Shouldn't mix that up. There's a way forward. And that's at the heart of the Christian story. That in the midst of the worst of atrocities, God does not let things sit right there. Today you listen to a story where Jesus stood outside the tomb of Lazarus and he wept because the reality of the situation was just so much. And then he called Lazarus out of the tomb. And then he looked at the community around him and said, unbind him. Our history has been bound up in so much genocide and so much violence and so much evil. And I think Jesus is asking us in this moment, as Jesus calls that which was dead out of the tomb and is looking at us and says, all right, it's your job, do the unbinding. And we have to do this work. I know it was our ancestors who perpetrated lots of this. But our job is to do the unbinding so that healing can begin. Reverend Mark Charles is a reformed Dene, with the Navajo, the name for themselves is Dene. Mark Charles says, the work we have ahead of us isn't reconciliation because we were never together. You didn't show up as our friends. You showed up as conquerors. So we can't reconcile. Let's begin the work of conciliation. 500 years isn't too late, he tells us. We can begin the work of becoming friends and neighbors to each other now. And I can think of nothing else that would make Jesus happier. Do you have any questions, comments, thoughts? I know there's a lot. I think I might have another slide. I can't remember. Where are we at? Yeah. Boop. Thoughts? Where are we at?
What are you doing on the 15th again?
It's called the blanket ceremony.
Is it open to everyone?
We've got some extra spaces, so if you want to, maybe having a couple people from here come join in so you can bring it back here. I would love to talk about that. Plus, you're over at UWL. We want that work to go there, too. So the blank exercise is this indigenous way to walk you through what I've talked about, but in a very indigenous way. It's not a presentation. What they'll do is find a big space and put a lot of blankets down, and the blankets represent Turtle Island, which is the indigenous North American way of talking about North America. And then all the participants take on a tribal identity. They represent a nation. And you walk around the blankets and they talk about what life was like here before colonization. And then they'll walk us through the 500 years to get to today, and they'll take blankets off the ground representing land stolen, so there's less land, and they will take nations away. Because as I said before, there are nations who were fully genocided, like completely. As we talked about, the Caribbean nations were the first to have this happen. And there are many more. So, and then the good thing is, unlike what I'm giving you and walking away, right, they end with healing circles, where people split up into smaller groups and you'll be taken through a healing ceremony. Because the end goal of this isn't, that happened, that sucked, now we go home. The end result is hopefully that happened, it's terrible, it's continuing on today, and how do we be better than our ancestors? And I understand too, like, it's complicated. My ancestors were fleeing a famine that was being forced on them. I don't think my Irish ancestors were terrible people. I don't think they came to this continent to go be conquerors. But it's what they became, right? I don't think any of your ancestors were sitting in Europe and one day saying, like, I can't wait to go to North America to take part in one of the worst genocides in human history. But it is what happened. And so we have to figure all these things out. And I know for a lot of us, this is not how we were raised to think about our country. So, yeah. Yeah. That would be as varied as individuals. I think in some ways, what I think a lot of Native folks I've talked to, do you understand, like, where are you from and whose land was that? That's a beginning step. I'm from Grosse Ile, Michigan, which was taken from the Potawatomi Nation in 1776. So just some recognition. Ben Ramirez Shikwanabe, my professor and mentor through college, his doctoral research project, his dissertation was that he went all over North America and he asked first graders a question. He said, tell me your thoughts about Indians. And the answers were, Indians, they lived in teepees. Indians, they scalped people. Indians, they were fierce warriors. Indians, and he said, actually, what wasn't disturbing? The racial stereotypes weren't the disturbing part. It was that almost without exception, they were spoken of in the past tense. So I think for a lot of Native people, the first thing that they want us to know is we're still here. And we have struggles, but we're a proud people who are working our best to thrive. And that we can't heal if the larger culture doesn't even recognize that we still exist. This is why the large Native, the big Indian statue at Riverside Park was so offensive to many Ho-Chunk people. Was because it didn't depict, as Dan Green, a Ho-Chunk professor at UWL said, if we want to make it actually a Ho-Chunk person, why don't we put a Packers jersey on him? Because that's what I dress like. Why do I have to be wearing buckskin and standing like this with my peace pipe? Like, that's not us. And so one of the first things I think is to recognize we have Ho-Chunk neighbors, right? The Three Rivers House over on Main Street in La Crosse, it's a Ho-Chunk community center. Where my Lakota niece went every day after school because she just needed to be around indigenous folks. And there's a lot of open events. Every year in the summer at UWL, there's a powwow, and you're invited to it. And you should go. You should go eat some fry bread tacos, which are delicious and also full of the sad story of food on reservations. You know? Recognizing that they're still here and they're our neighbors. I think that's a really big start that I would, other than that, I think the answers get really varied after that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Always. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, here's a couple things I think can be said. One, to your first point about the home loans, his name just slipped my mind. I just lost it. He's got a great book. He's from northern Wisconsin. He wrote a book called The Res Road Follies. But one of the things he says is only 3 things that the federal government legislates around with blood: dog breeds, racehorses, and Native Americans. Which is why they can do things like, we got to make sure, well, they have enough Indian, they have a quanta, the proper quanta of Indian blood, so we can regulate their lives. That has always stuck with me. Racehorses, dogs, and Native Americans, the federal government feels like they can legislate around that. I think the point that I always find is the best to go back to is that the people who oftentimes don't want to stare our nation's history in the face, things are very complicated in some ways with respect to our black neighbors. With Native Americans, I feel like issues of justice are actually much easier to address because what you can point to is Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution. We have treaty obligations. Start every conversation with that. The law states, and a lot of the people who are also, that we have some of the hardest, I'm just going to say it, and you can do what you want with it, but some of the people that are hardest to have conversations with this are also people who like to be very patriotic. And so use their language. You love this country? Yes. You believe in this Constitution? Yes. I mean, you are a constitutional conservative? Yes. Then honor the damn treaty. Begin with their language. If you believe in this country and you believe in honor, and here's the other piece which I should have said. Nobody serves in our armed services at a higher proportion than Native Americans. So there is no more patriotic person in the country than a Native American. I did 48 funerals in a year on the reservation. Every single man over 18's funeral that I did, every single one of them had an honor guard at it because they were a veteran. Harold was a paratrooper in the 101 Airborne. As he always said, when we were in Vietnam and they were jumping out of the planes yelling Geronimo, I jumped out and I yelled Custer. That's his best joke. But I mean, so in some ways, I think that some of these conversations, I know you're from South Dakota. What you'll find is the case is that a lot of times people in areas without a lot of Native American neighbors are less racist than Native Americans. The closer you get to a reservation, the higher the racism is going to go. That's a fact. Because you will be, let's be honest, when you live next to reservations, there is a high crime rate. Why there's a high crime rate? Poverty, generational trauma, all these ills that have been forced upon them. They didn't start out this way, but this is the current situation. And so I think using these are communities of veterans. We have treaty obligations. This is the Constitution we're talking about, people. And then just kind of see where the conversation goes from there, because I think a lot of people I've used that with some success. Not always. Yeah. And then, that some people just, I've done these talks and I've watched people just shut down and I try to have empathy for that. Because if your story of the country is this, we can't expect that in a 45-minute presentation it's going to 180. But let's hope that those seeds get planted. You got a microphone?
I just have this because if anybody has a question, I was going to give it to you so that we could hear it because we're recording it. Are there other questions or comments? Michelle? Right up to your face.
When I grew up, my next door neighbor was Native American.
Yeah.
So there was just nothing odd about a Native American. And then in San Diego. And then I moved to Phoenix. And I lived literally a block off the reservation. I went to school on the reservation when I went to college. And I was 19, 20 years old.
Yeah.
First time away from home. And I can remember calling my mom saying, I would love to have a house given to me. These people have a house given to me and they're not taking care of it. Now my mom born in the 30s, I expected her to agree with me. And she said to me, "Stop it, Michelle." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Nobody ever asked them what they wanted. They gave them what we thought they wanted. Why would you take care of something you never wanted? They don't believe that you can own the land. We believe you can own the land." And I was just like, oh. And when we look at reservations, we were giving them what we thought they needed and wanted. And that completely changed my mind.
Yeah.
And I don't have a good relationship and didn't then with my mother, so we're pearls of wisdom. But that has always stuck with me. That, why don't they, and then what Bishop Aarons has also schooled me on this, they weren't assimilating. Why aren't they assimilating? Because that's always what, I grew up to want.
Yeah.
I want a house, I want a car, I want a picket fence.
Right.
They don't believe you can own the land. You're caretakers. And that, but to get people of my generation to understand that, it's very difficult. Because it's like, we give. No, you don't give. We took. We owe.
Yeah.
But that's a hard thing.
Yeah. And Bishop Aarons grew up right next to a reservation. This is the reservation I served on. I actually knew Bishop's dad, had coffee with him before I knew him, but he grew up, and his family was rare. I mean, Jim had Ojibwe friends his whole life. He has a lot of respect up there on the Leech Lake Reservation. That's something to just know about your former bishop, is that he's always had good relationships and has stood for his Ojibwe friends and neighbors. And that's not very common where he's from in Walker. Dr. Nash. Durance.
So just in case this comes up in conversation, when a land use recognition statement has been created and it's found its foundation and settled into an organization or a spot, I mean, then what? When we look beyond that and, the
Well, I would
5-year
say,
plan, I mean, just kind of where do things go after that beyond just the words?
yeah, don't just adopt a statement. So we have this opportunity to work with Larry Little George and the Alliance for Justice. And if you're looking to take on a recognition statement, that's a good place to start. Do it in conjunction with our Ho-Chunk neighbors. The Alliance for Justice will work with you on that, bring you through different trainings and ways of partnership. And then they'll give you you can get a flag to hang right at your entrance with an eagle feather and an eagle staff on it and a plaque which kind of explains what this is all about. Land recognition statement, in a lot of ways, it's the beginning. It's not the end. It's the first step you take to acknowledge. I would say for all of you, like, what do we do next? Know that all 3 of our schools of higher learning bring in speakers all the time who are Indigenous, not just some white guy who's been blessed to hang around with Indigenous people for years, right? But hey, it's a start. 2 is there are books. I would recommend everybody read The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer. He's a Leech Lake Ojibwe. This is about a 3-year-old book, and it begins by saying, oftentimes Wounded Knee becomes the end of the whole. Like, look in your high school history book. After the Battle of Wounded Knee, we don't talk about natives anymore. Well, we're still here. We have a long history from that point. And so, just beginning to have these conversations. The Three Rivers House in La Crosse. They're always having events and speakers that are open to the public. Black River Falls is where the tribal headquarters of the Ho-Chunk Nation is. They have things going on. The UCC at their camp, their Green Lake camp, always has peace and justice for reconciliation things happening in the summertime. So there's lots of things going on. Ask your school district. Is it Act 8? Does anybody remember what it's called? Act 7. Our state has mandated that we teach Indigenous history, and the curriculum has been worked on by the Indigenous people of this state. Most schools aren't doing it. It is law. Again, here's the point, this is the law. The schools have to teach this. They're not teaching it. The funding's not there. The will is not there. So there's a lot of things that another thing to do that is quite meaningful is stop perpetuating the Thanksgiving myth. Never happened. We came and we had this bloody story, and then we made up a story for ourselves, which we did. There was never a Thanksgiving feast. That did not exist. We made up a story for ourselves about how we were super buddies. And then once a year, we tell that story. My sister-in-law in Ankeny, Iowa, she started as a kindergarten teacher, and she was horrified, and she's now leaving her job because the school district still has kids dress up like Indians. And when she fought it, it's gone very poorly for her. So this still happens. And it's also worth remembering when you think about the dates of Native American religious liberty and all this, at the same time the boarding schools were happening, when we were forcing Native kids out, taking them out of their homes, cutting their hair, making them wear Western clothes, that was the same time period when our kids were raised playing cowboys and Indians. The Boy Scouts still dress up as Indians. It's egregious. The Boy Scouts have to stop it, like full stop. Because I'm the Order of the Arrow and I have a headdress. Like, no, our young white kids shouldn't be making headdresses, right? And so you're going to, after this, I hope that you just see all over the place. It was a beautiful thing when we dropped the R word from the Washington football team, right? School districts all over still have Native mascots. Not helpful stuff. So you're going to see this in many different places, and I hope that you say, wait a minute, that's not right. What can we do better? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Online question, and let's make that the last one because it's 1:30. Oh.
Okay, so here's some good book recommendations. Again, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer. That's fantastic. There's lots of short stories and novels by Sherman Alexie, who has been a really prolific Native American author. There's a show on, is it FX has Reservation Dogs? Anybody know? Yeah. Hulu. So if you have the chance, there is a television show about some Oklahoma young kids on a reservation and their life, and it's absolutely hilarious, and it's written, produced, directed by indigenous people. So it's this amazing entree into a very, the humor that is very prevalent in Native society, and you're letting them tell their story as opposed to us telling their story, like watching The Searchers or something, right? Some other good books. There's a book written, Neither Wolf Nor Dog. And that's a good book. That's also written by a white person, and so there are some critiques of that book, but I think if there's somebody that you know that might be hard to talk about, I think that's a good book to start with. Because sometimes it's really awesome to have the person telling the story, but we know that sometimes people can't hear that. So I would say that's like an entry-level book to talk about this. There's The Land Looks After Us is a great book. Other books that probably aren't as helpful, like the classic of Black Elk Speaks. Well, that was written by a white anthropologist, taking Black Elk's words and kind of making it what he wanted it to look like. So just know that there's a lot of controversy about some of the classics out there. A lot of Native nations and Native people are coming out and saying, that's not our story. Let us tell our story. Pretty Shield is an interesting book that was assigned years ago. The Res Road and the Res Road Follies are the collection of a Fond du Lac Ojibwe guy from up here in Wisconsin. It's just a collection of his articles put into a book. They're all very funny. They're a great place to start. And there is a newspaper called Indian Country Today. Go online. It will show all the new, this is Indian Country Today is they say it's the voice of Native North America. And these are the Native reporters and thinkers, and all these people come together to make this national media platform. And I try to check in with it once a week because it lets you know what's happening in what is oftentimes called Indian Country. And Indian Country Today will also lead you through a lot of any movie that has natives in it, they will give a movie review from a Native perspective. So you might find it shocking to find out that the recent Predator movie, you know, Predator, where the alien comes down and kills everybody, well, the most recent one happens with Comanche people. Well, this horror movie went and sat down with Comanche elders and worked really hard to get Comanche culture right. And so Indian Country Today was like, check out this crazy horror movie that does a great job of portraying Comanche culture. So you might be surprised in where some of these great things come from, right? But yeah, so I would say today when you get home, go on your computer, just go to Indian Country Today and bookmark that so it sits there so everyone's feel like, what is happening in Indian Country? And what are they telling the rest of us that we might need to hear? So, and then finally, just know that the Synod's working on this stuff. Bishop Felix has made our relationship with our Ho-Chunk neighbors a priority. And here's the thing. You're all here because you wanted to be here, right? There's going to come a point at Synod Assembly where we're going to talk about a land recognition. And everybody's not going to love it. So we're going to need people who have taken the time to do what you've done today and then go further with it. And meet our indigenous leaders in our communities and listen to what they have to say, because we need to do this work, because every single church in the Synod is on stolen land. So.
Thank you, Ben. One suggestion I have for a podcast is This Land. It's a podcast about the reservations in Oklahoma, and how they have been pretty systematically and cleverly purchased up by white people, and then it's gone to the Supreme Court a couple times, and it's also told really well in episodes, so I would recommend that. The stories we avail ourselves of are kind of what, where our heart goes, right? That's where and how we come to know God's grace, and so this is a really fertile ground for us to learn more about how God works and how God loves. Ben, you are a gift to us. I'm going to clap for you first. Thank you. But thank you for sharing this story with us. I think it's a story that's new to most of us, or at least parts of it are new to us, and we need to hear it. So thank you for sharing it.
The two things I want to say is, one, the ELCA,
We
have a reconciliation center on Pine Ridge. It's in the Pine Ridge Agency. So if you are ever looking like where's something you can do, oftentimes I one time worked for a mission trip company, and I remember going around and a Yakima elder came in and goes, white Christian for the summer. How many times are you guys going to paint my trailer this year? 7, 8? Doesn't need it, but I know you're going to do it. And I was just like, yeah, we are here to paint. Right? So it was a little bit of like, But we have this reconciliation center, so that's a way to go visit a reservation and not just be there thinking we're white saviors because we can paint buildings, but to do the real work of this reconciliation. The second piece is look up, as you're writing down, Thunder Valley. So in South Dakota right now, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, there is a group, they're not taking any government money to do it because they just don't want the government's little fingers all over what they want. They've gone around and interviewed elders and young people and said, what kind of housing community do you want? And they're saying, well, we want it in a circle like our teepees used to be. And so we're in a real community, and we want food sovereignty. So we want our native crops, and we want buffalo herds out there. And so families who have no ability to buy a house outside of these crappy government houses, whole families are joined together, like building houses that are solar arrayed, and like it's amazing. And my Hunka brother, he's out there. He's one of the construction workers on the lead on this, and so much of the history is all about the bad stuff. There's amazingly beautiful stuff happening in Native North America, and we need to avail ourselves of those stories too. And Thunder Valley is a great way to start.
Let's pray. God, we are grateful for Ben, for all these experiences you've graced him with, and that he'd be courageous enough to share them with us, and that we pray that we would now be courageous too in testifying to what we've heard, perhaps learning more about what we wonder. Be with us in this journey that is either beginning or continuing, wherever it is. May you be with us in it. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Thanks for coming. Yeah.